thank you so much. I'm thrilled to talk with you today, Christine, and happy to hear your insights. Can we maybe get started with a brief introduction? You tell us who you are.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me with you today. My name is Christine Cruz Vergara. I'm currently the Vice President for Higher Education and Student Success at Handshake. We're the #1 place for college students to find jobs and internships, and I've been here for about 2 years. Prior to my time at Handshake, I actually spent the past decade of my career working in higher education, and I'm actually originally from the DC metro area. So the easiest way to remember my resume is I've worked at all the Georges, GW, Georgetown, and GW. And after that, I was the associate provost at Wellesley College outside of Boston before coming out west to San Francisco. So excited to be here with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, let's dig right into the questions. More and more employers are giving increased energy to diversity recruitment, and we're so happy to see that, actually, that energy. I know that diversity can mean many different things to different people. What does diversity mean to students? Also to employers, and I know you all do many surveys through Handshake and have an opportunity to capture a lot of data around that. And how do those definitions or what it means to each other differ between those two groups?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways that you can kind of look at this. So I think on one level, you can look at it from a language perspective. I think a lot of times people use diversity and inclusion interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. However, I think people sort of say DEI, DNI, diversity and inclusion, or they say one word hoping that it means the other. And I think it's important to actually kind of parse that out. So I think sometimes when people say diversity, literally what they mean is just representation of different individuals with different backgrounds, whether that's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, academic background. There's a number of different ways that a population can be diverse. However, when you're thinking about inclusion, and I actually think more students, when they are looking for a workplace, they actually mean inclusion, not just diversity. They don't want to just see representation. They actually want to know that the environment that they're going into is composed of behaviors and social norms that actually ensure people feel welcome, right? That's actually what inclusion means. And I think a lot of times when students think diversity or they think employers that are committed to diversity, that's actually what they're referring to. They're referring to inclusion. So how are you retaining your talent? How are you ensuring that they have a voice at the table? Things like that. I also would be remiss if I didn't share, when you talk about diversity, I think right now the biggest conversation sort of starter for most people is we want to have more Black representation. We want to have more Latinx representation. And that is fantastic. That's obviously a wonderful goal for all of us to have. However, diversity does include women in male-dominated fields. It might include men in female-dominated fields. It might include people from different parts of the country. It might include hiring students or recent graduates from schools that you don't typically recruit at, right? It could mean different academic backgrounds, so you have a different way of thinking about problems or approaching an issue. So you can actually think about diversity in a very broad sort of spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece. That inclusion piece is definitely what I hear from students too. I'm wondering, do you feel that this has been kind of a shift because of the generational shift? I'm just wondering, do you think this was something that wasn't necessarily as much of a concern for maybe previous generations in terms of seeing that inclusion, or is it just that this generation is a bit more vocal about that need?
I think it's both and. I mean, I think there's been a continual shift, luckily, in society, in my opinion, towards the right direction. However, I think 2020 in particular has really highlighted for our society and for our country and our world the types of social inequities that really exist and the ramifications, the implications of that. And I think our current generation of students are more vocal about it. I think they're more comfortable to be vocal about it. I think they've also grown up as children in their K-12 education, feeling more comfortable, both acknowledging differences and actually starting to appreciate it, right? When I think about my own sort of elementary background, I mean, I remember not wanting to be seen as different. I'm Chinese American. I'm a daughter of 2 immigrants, and I wanted nothing but to be white. I wanted to be like everybody else. I didn't want to eat different foods. I didn't want to dress differently. I didn't have an appreciation for my background in the same way that I think children these days are more encouraged to, at a younger age, to actually embrace those differences. And I think that has impact by the time you get to college and you start
Absolutely.
looking for work. I think it makes you feel more comfortable in your own skin. It helps you go through your own identity development at a different stage and at a different rate. And it allows you to kind of come to terms with that and what you're looking for and what you ask for.
Absolutely. You hit some of this already in when you kind of talked about the previous answer, but what are some of the ways that student applicants have expressed that they want to see diversity and inclusion within the organizations to which they are applying?
Sure. I'll list actually kind of the top 5 that I typically hear the most. The first is representation at the highest levels. And so students want to see that your board, your executive team, the leadership in terms of VPs and directors and managers are representative of the population that you may be serving. So that is definitely one piece that I know more students are starting to ask questions about. And if it doesn't look that way, what are your hiring plans or your promotion plans or your advancement plans to start to change some of that? The second is affinity groups. And I would say it's not actually good enough to just have an ERG or an affinity group as part of your organization, but students actually want to know, is there executive involvement? Do you have somebody on the exec team that's actually involved in some of these? Are they active? Do you have regular meetings? Is there real resourcing that's actually put behind some of these ERGs, right? So students are getting a little savvier about asking some of those more specific questions. The third is an interesting one, which I think some people don't typically categorize as part of diversity and inclusion, but mental health benefits is actually an area that we've started to see more students. I believe it's over, our most recent survey is like over 53% of students now would really like employers to actually include mental health benefits as part of the compensation package. And I think that's, obviously partially it's 2020, so who doesn't need mental health support, right? But I think it's also it's wonderful to actually see some of the stigma around mental health start to dissipate as more people are realizing that it can be preventative. It can be very good for you to be able to maintain equilibrium, right? And it helps you to actually maintain a healthier workforce and a healthier talent pipeline as well. So that's the third thing. The fourth would be regular pay equity reviews, transparent sharing of salaries, bands, discrepancies, things like that. Now, obviously, there's a whole spectrum of some companies that literally share everybody's salary down to the dollar. There are others where they're not going to share that, but they are going to share leveling. They're going to share salary bands across functions. They're going to be very transparent about how comp decisions are made, right? So you don't necessarily have to share everyone's salary to be transparent. It's a matter of figuring out what works for the culture of your organization. But more students are definitely expecting some level of transparency so that they know how decisions are made and who's at the table to make those decisions as well. Is there a committee? Is it just the VP of HR or people in talent? Is it the CEO, right? And is that group of decision makers, are they diverse in the way that they are looking at this as well? And then the fifth, I would say this will probably seem potentially the most ambiguous, but a lot of students really just want acknowledgement and real conversation about what's working, what's not working, and what can be better at their organizations. So they appreciate employers that can be honest about, look, we don't have it figured out. And the reality is, how many of us really do? We're all kind of a work in progress. And so I think when you're able to say, look, this is what we do well. We actually have great gender diversity. But what we don't do well is we actually don't have a lot of Black candidates, and we need to do better there. And this is what we're planning on doing to try and get better. I think a lot of students really appreciate that authenticity and they appreciate that honesty about where you actually are and how they can actually be part of that solution.
Yeah, that's huge. I think that students who get that information on the front end are able to make a more informed decision about how do they want to be involved, if this is an organization that they want to be a part of, and if they can see themselves helping to support that change. And I think that that is definitely something I see amongst students, is wanting to support change, wanting to be, change agents and really make those types of shifts happen with organizations. So yeah, that's great. So some recruiting practices and criteria can unknowingly discourage or exclude underrepresented minority students from applying, and meaning underrepresented minority from any perspective. What are some of the practices or criteria that you have seen that do this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few, and actually at Handshake, we've done a little bit of research on this in the past year with some of our data to sort of see how this plays out. So one is having an arbitrary GPA cutoff of 3.5. That's one of the most common recruiting practices that we see across many different industries, some of the most lucrative and difficult to get into. And we've actually known for a really long time, even outside of the DEI conversation, that GPA is actually not a good indicator of whether someone's going to be good at their performance in their job, right? But it is a number that makes it easy for you to be able to cut off applications, right? And when you are sifting through hundreds or thousands of applications, you might feel like you need something. Unfortunately, when you have this arbitrary cutoff, let's say of 3.5, you actually unintentionally leave out sometimes 1.5 times Black students, for example, or Latinx students, right? And so you actually want to open up your GPA window. If you're going to have a GPA cutoff, you should open it up to like a 2.8 or 2.7. 3.0, you're actually going to be able to allow for more students to be in that pool. Now, part of the reasoning behind this, for those that might be wondering, well, why is this? It is because if you think about the history of sort of what our Black and Brown communities have had to face, there's social inequity, which leads to educational inequity, which leads to housing inequity, right? All of that compounds year over year over year as students go through their educational systems, and they have very differing levels of essentially both educational attainment to resources, to teachers, right, to the types of courses that other students that might have been in more affluent areas would have been able to attain, which then contributes to GPA, right? And so GPA is not always a good reflection of talent, it's a good reflection of money. And so GPA is one really big one. The second is having a short recruitment window. So again, there are certain industries that do more of this, where they recruit, fall recruitment season is like beginning of September to middle of October, and it's essentially like a 6-week window. Well, when you do that, you actually leave out, again, a bunch of candidates from underrepresented groups. And again, the reason why is because many of these students have other obligations. Potentially they have to work themselves to be able to support them going to school. They might have to watch their family or take care of family, which is other pressing needs on their time. So they can't just go to school, participate in extracurriculars, and work on their applications, right? So when you have a really short window of time, someone might be juggling a 20-hour-a-week job, 20 hours a week of school, trying to do their homework. And when they have to put their application together, they might not have all the time that they need to not only put together a really great package, but get it reviewed by career services, get it reviewed by a mentor, and then actually fix all of those things. And if they don't feel really good about what they're putting forward, they might not. And so then you're not going to see as many. So opening up your recruiting window to have kind of just-in-time hiring, or at least rolling hiring, could be helpful to you. The third is not disclosing compensation. So again, students from underrepresented groups, think about our first gen students, for example. If this is the first time going to school, this might also be the first time that they're going through a recruitment process to try and get their first job. And the type of job that they might be going after may be drastically different than what their family or their parents had, right? And the experience that they would have had. And so right now they have no guidance from their family per se to look at what type of compensation is good enough. Is that going to help me pay off my bills? Am I going to be able to support myself? Will I be able to support my family? For some students that have to do that, right? And so being upfront about your compensation can actually increase your candidates by 13%, your underrepresented candidates by 13%. And when you can actually share relocation costs, you can increase that. I want to say, if I remember our report correctly, I think it's like up to 30% or so. So relocation is also a really big one to be able to share. And then the fourth one that I'll leave you with is having really lengthy job descriptions and non-inclusive language can actually keep women from applying for jobs, in particular STEM positions. And so that's something to think about. Now, again, you might be wondering why. The inclusive language probably makes a lot of sense, but it's literally verbs like demanding, intense, relentless, competitive, right? Those are the types of terms that tend to actually steer some of your female candidates away. Whereas using more inclusive terms like collaborate, partner, develop, you'll actually see an increase. And you literally could be talking about the same thing, but your choice in verb makes a difference in the kind of sort of culture and environment that you're creating. Now, with the lengthy job description, you might be wondering why, again, that is. Most of us have actually heard the study that's been done before, where when a female looks at a job description, They typically want to be able to do like 95 to 99% of the job before they feel comfortable applying. Whereas a lot of your male candidates might look at it and go, I think I can do about 60% of this. They would go for it, right? And so the longer the job description, the more it sometimes can actually discourage some of your female candidates from applying because they might feel like they don't meet all of the qualifications. So it's as easy as actually even adding a statement in your job description that says, we want you to apply, even if you can't do all these things, right? So just make it explicit that you would still like those candidates to apply.
I like that idea, including that statement. I'm also, I mean, obviously I haven't done the research here the way that you all have, but I'm also just thinking too, as you think about aspects of like imposter syndrome that, you know, many students may face. I would imagine some of those same aspects in play when they, you know, read a job description and again, feel like, oh, I can't do every single thing here, or I may not be able to do it well. Or if, you know, I know sometimes in trying to describe the organization, it may sound like, you know, the organization is just this very pinnacle of success. We are the premier global, you know, whatever, which is wonderful and may be accurate, but it may be like, okay, then I'm probably not supposed to be there, you know, so. That's a good point.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really reasonable hypothesis, honestly.
Yeah.
I think we hear that in our work with students all the time. I mean, over the years, I've probably advised thousands of students, and I think that imposter syndrome and that doubt is very real. The lack of confidence. I mean, they haven't done this before, right? And it's understandable that it's a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah. Yep. No, very good. And the part about GPA too, I think is so true. And just that does it, to your point. Someone could be working a 20-hour-a-week job and not have the time necessarily to devote to their studies the way that they want. So they may not have that 3.5, but certainly they have developed great work ethic in working and balancing school studies and extracurricular. And so those are truly, to your point, that it's not a determinant of performance. Great stuff there. So as we kind of shift and think about COVID-19, we know that it certainly had an impact on all students. How has the impact on the underrepresented population of minority students been different from an opportunity perspective?
Yeah, well, I think on one level, it's been harder because of the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on certain families and communities, particularly our Black and Brown communities. Those populations have had more job loss, they have had more death, right? They've had more negative consequence to COVID, many of whom have had service level positions or frontline positions where they haven't been able to work from home. So they've been exposed. And so for a lot of those students, they've either needed to support their families, they've had to work, some have had to drop out of school themselves, and they've had to pick up part-time jobs, which also remind you, not work from home positions and often. And so we've seen that. And when we actually look at our decreases in even academic and institutional enrollment, you see a dip when it comes to our Black students. And community college enrollment, which usually goes up during a recession, has actually gone down this recession. And in particular, has gone down most significantly for Black students. And so we're really seeing some of the, I would say, aggregate impact that over time, we're going to actually see the ripple effect of some of that. So that's on one level. On the other hand, COVID has also actually allowed for more increase in access to opportunity for those that have been able to stay with their sort of institutional education and to be able to find opportunities. And what I mean by that is because of COVID, essentially all recruiting has become virtual. Now, at Handshake, we were already seeing that trend happen before COVID. Many employers were already starting to move virtually. What COVID did was simply accelerate what would have happened over the next 2 to 3 years into 2 to 3 months, right? It compressed that timeline. And what it did this year, though, was ensure that every event, every panel, every networking thing, every career fair, everything was virtual. And what that allowed people to do was for students who might not have a car, for students who might have a family or children that they have to take care of, or family members that they might be trying to support, it allowed them to be able to participate in something like what we're doing right now from the safety of their home, right? They could have their camera off while they're trying to feed their kid dinner, but still be listening to the panel and still picking up some of that and chatting in their questions, right? It allowed people to still be available, which was really exciting. And one of the things that we actually saw was an increase in student attendance from our underrepresented groups, our Black students, our Latinx students, and our women in technology students. We actually saw an increase in their attendance and in their engagement, at least in handshake hosted events virtually. And so that was really exciting to see. So we're glad that access can be increased, but you kind of have to get over some of those other barriers first and ensure that students aren't like dropping out of school and they're not leaving in order to actually have that access.
I also thought about another thing that can probably has assisted in this process to allow students access to more of these virtual events is there's no pressure to figure out a professional dress attire. You know, so many times,
Yeah.
you know, professional dress can be a barrier. It can be cost, you know, prohibitive or, you know, just lack of access. I know many schools have created career closets and other resources and things, but not everyone has that. And so if you only have to, either if you don't have to have your video on, you only have to look professional from here up, then it's a lot easier. You know, you can recycle the same shirt or whatever if you needed to. It's certainly, you know, yeah, absolutely. So great.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I will say, actually, there's one other thing is by being virtual, it's actually allowed for students that typically feel either underprepared or more nervous in physical in-person events, actually sometimes feel more prepared, right? And this might sound slightly counterintuitive because some people really enjoy the in-person event, but what we've actually heard from students, so let's just take like a virtual fair, for example, Handshake's virtual fair format is either a scheduled one-on-one or a group session. Because one of the things that you can take out when you don't have to be in person are the long lines and the crowded gym. Right? Like those are like the two things that the students hate most because it like feels kind of anxiety ridden. It's like you're just a number and you're
as you're waiting, your stomach's bubbling to just talk to someone. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then you get what, like 2 minutes to try and give your pitch, if that, and then that's it, gone, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of students said this felt much more calm. I was able to know in advance who I was going to meet with. I could do my research on that person. And then I knew that I had 10 minutes of dedicated time and I didn't have to rush and I could just have a conversation. And I didn't feel like I needed to pitch myself. I felt like I could talk. And so, and listen. And I think that really also appeals when you talk about diversity, that appeals to also different types of thinking and to different types of communication styles. And so it allows employers to also find different talent in that way.
That's so interesting. Well, last question as we wrap up here. What are the top 3 best practices or recommendations for employers committed to diversity recruitment?
Sure. So I am actually going to tell you the top 3 best practices are from a colleague of mine, Aubrey Blanche. She is amazing, works at Culture Amp, and she does a lot of this diversity and inclusion work. And we had a really great fireside chat just a few months ago. And I actually would love to tell you what she said, because I think it is just spot on. So the first is that you have to intentionally design bias out. If you do not actually intentionally design it out, it's still there. And so it doesn't just happen. You have to intentionally design it out. And so that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is if you design for the margins, you will lift up the center. If you design for the margins and for those communities that are most marginalized, you will still lift up the center, right? It's kind of the rising tide lifts all boats sort of idea. And then her third is adjust by 1%. And I really love this. Her thought here is people get overwhelmed when they think about DEI and they think about what needs to be done, because the reality is there is a lot that we need to do. There's a lot that our society needs to improve upon, but it can feel overwhelming as an individual to try and feel like, well, where do I even start? Or what is my role in that? And so she always reminds people, just adjust by 1%. Think about your job, your role, what you personally have influence over, and adjust it and design bias out by 1%. Look for one thing that you can do to design it out. One decision you can make better that will improve it, right? And slowly that 1% will gain traction. And if everybody just does 1%, collectively, we are doing a lot more, right? But she says, try not to essentially like chew off everything, just 1%, and slowly you will be able to get influence and buy-in and continued support. So I think those are, in my opinion, those are 3 really great tips that allow everybody to kind of just immediately get started.
Absolutely. I love that. I think spot on. That 1% is the key. You do a little bit because it can seem certainly overwhelming and it can be discouraging. It's like, well, if we can't do everything, then we might as well not do anything, or we'll put it off until next year or whatever. So I think like that 1%, everybody doing their 1% will make huge effects. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today and your great insight. Thank you for all that you are doing at Handshake and what Handshake has done to really support students and employers in this very interesting time. And even before, I know we certainly are big proponents of Handshake at Hopkins and are appreciative of all that the platform offers. So thank you for that. And the valuable insights that you all are bringing in terms of the research in some of this space has been very helpful too.
So appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely.